Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, lands that were never ceded, and to acknowledge their elders past and present, and to acknowledge the elders of the lands wherever you are calling in from, and any Indigenous colleagues that are joining us today. What I'm going to be presenting today is work that we've done for the Victorian government, who commissioned some work around building the capacity of faith leaders, particularly, to both prevent and respond to violence against women and family violence. That commissioning of work came out of the Royal Commission that was held here in Victoria, which was came out of I guess, the commitment of the state government. And really, I want to acknowledge the work of Rosie Batty, who I think galvanised work that people had been working towards for decades, but really her braveness and eloquence after the death of her son really, I think, opened a lot of doors for major change in Victoria. That Royal Commission made 227 recommendations, and the government committed to implementing all of them. And two of those a number of recommendations are relevant to faith communities, but two of them were specifically around building capacity of faith leaders. And so that's where this work is related to. Let's move to the next slide. The project was developed with the Multicultural Affairs and Social Cohesion Division, as it was known then. It's had a name change since, in Premier and Cabinet, and working with the Multi-Faith Advisory Group that was mentioned earlier. And we did this project in partnership with the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, recognising that while many faith groups might be more Anglo-Celtic than others, all faith communities in Victoria need to be able to work in a multicultural environment. And for some faiths, that's really particularly important. And so this had a very strong relationship with groups working particularly on multicultural affairs. We did a big review of what's known, so the kind of evaluation and research evidence, and that's what I'm going to mainly talk about today, to try and identify, well, what do we already know about what works, working particularly to build capacity of faith leaders, but also around faith communities more broadly. And then we worked with the Multi-Faith Advisory Group to choose some faith communities who wanted to implement pilot projects, which were done by the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, the Buddhist Council of Victoria, a number of Hindu communities, which was actually through the Faith Communities Council of Victoria, the Sikh Gurdwara Council of Victoria, and the Uniting Church in Victoria and Tasmania, but focused in Victoria, to develop their own projects. And then we've evaluated those and sort of documented what's been learned from those projects. And that, I think, I'm happy to talk about next time we all meet. Suffice to say that those projects and those faith communities deserve all the credit in the world for powering through and trying to implement these programs during the lockdowns in Melbourne through COVID. So it was a really difficult time to implement these kinds of projects. And so I think what we've learned from it, there's limitations to the evidence generated by these projects because of the time that they were being delivered. But what we know from the international literature is we do have good evidence about causes and contributing factors in relation to violence against women and family violence in faith settings. And some of them you've already brought up today. So firstly, I think this is a really important thing to highlight at the start, is that the family violence or domestic violence response sector, and that includes groups like police and frontline services, have historically failed to engage with faith leaders and communities. So it was very interesting to listen to Deacon Oliver talk about that challenge and the efforts they're making to try and bridge some of those gaps in New South Wales, because I think that in secular domestic violence services, there's often been a thinking or an assumption that faith communities or faith leaders might be part of the problem in terms of violence against women, which is an unfair assumption. And it also becomes self-fulfilling. So if you have that assumption and therefore don't engage with faith communities, then they're not having the opportunities to learn and benefit from all the kind of expertise being generated in the secular sector. So I think that this gap between the two groups of organisations or communities is an important one to highlight. At the start, we also heard about, and particularly from Queensland, about work that, and it was really lovely to hear Carol talk about the work that they're doing to try and support faith communities around interpretation of faith teachings in scripture and language, knowing that in all faith traditions, there's evidence in scripture that could be used to, to promote peace and harmony in families and to not condone violence. But there's also in many traditions parts of scripture or teachings that can be interpreted in ways that excuse or minimize violence. And so it's really working with people from different faith traditions around how to respond to the misuse, I think, of teachings in scripture. There's also, I guess, one of the contributing factors in many traditions, and most of the literature around this comes from the Abrahamic faith, so particularly Christianity, but also Islam and Judaism, is that where there's structured gender inequality in faith traditions, that can make it more difficult for prevention and response of violence against women. We know that violence against women is very closely related to gender inequality. The more unequal a society is, the more gender inequality you have, that's an underlying driver of violence against women. So when you have institutions that have institutionalized gender inequality, that can be very difficult. In some faith traditions, another challenge in relation to violence against women particularly is barriers to divorce, so that when the faith teachings prevent women seeking a divorce or being granted a divorce, that can sort of pressure women and cause them to stay with a violent partner when they otherwise might not. But the fear of losing your faith and your faith community is such that, and the shame associated with that is such that women are often reluctant to seek divorce. And I think both Deacon Oliver and Carol spoke about a kind of denial and silence. And this is common it's not just in faith traditions, this issue. It's I work at a university, and many universities have a really sad history of sexual harassment of staff, and it's not talked about. And so I think that as institutions in society, we need to talk more openly about these challenges, and not to be defensive, to think that it's saying something about us. It's the whole of society problem, and to not deny that it happens. And then this last point, and it was raised very pertinently by Deacon Oliver and actually Carol, because Logan is so multicultural, is the way that faith intersects with culture and experiences of migration in ways that can mean that people are reluctant to report their experiences of violence, for example, because people don't want to, they're worried about being deported or losing their visa, or their partner losing their visa. They might be not wanting to bring a bad reputation or shame to their community, particularly when a community is subject to racism anyway. There's often a real desire to present the community in the best light, and those intersections can really shape willingness to speak openly about violence. But also cultural beliefs and religious beliefs intersect. They're impossible to separate for so many people. And so when cultures are very patriarchal, even if the scripture is not, then that can create an environment that may contribute to violence against women. So the evidence that we found about because this project was really to try and work with faith leaders to build their capacity. And this is where there are major gaps in what we know from the international evidence. What we do know is largely focused on projects that try and respond to violence against women. So that's projects that, how do you support a woman when she discloses to her deacon or her imam or her rabbi or whomever it might be that she's experiencing violence and needs help? There's been only a couple of really rigorous evaluations of those, mostly from the US and mostly in Christian traditions. A couple from, as I say, one from rigorous evaluation from a Jewish community and one from an Islamic community, but mostly from the Christian faiths. And what we learned from those evaluations about that importance of building bridges and two-way relationships between faith communities and faith settings, and domestic violence response services, and that it has to be two-way learning. I think sometimes, I work a lot in the domestic violence sector, and I think there's sometimes an assumption that they, from people, that they know everything and that they are going to go and teach faith leaders, but often know nothing about faith settings. And so there has to be two-way learning about what's going to be effective in a faith setting, and working with faith leaders and faith communities, as well as learning from the specialist in domestic violence about best practices in responding. But it has to be a two-way thing, because there's often an assumption that, domestic violence services want to say, oh, well, is a church or a temple a safe place for a woman to disclose that she's experiencing violence? And that's an important question to ask. But my question to domestic violence services is, are they safe for a woman to disclose their faith? And how is their faith respected in a violent setting? So, we've interviewed women who staff of refuges and other family violence services, and they'll often say, "Oh, yes, we accommodate people's spirituality," but it doesn't understand the way faith is in people's bones. How it's part of who they are, and it can sort of just not recognise the depth of which someone's soul is attached to their faith. And so that there's a real need to listen to that and hear that in the domestic violence space. It's not just having a room where someone can pray. That's important. It's important that people can eat food that is halal or in other way appropriate to their faith. That's all very important in domestic violence services, but I think it's listening and recognising that this is central to that person's being. So that's what has been learned about response-oriented projects. When we get to prevention, which is really starting to look at the relationships between men and women and the power between men and women and the sort of equality between men and women, there's far fewer interventions and resources for faith leaders to draw on. Of those that have been rigorously evaluated or that are available, they are often from low and middle income countries, interestingly. And I think this is largely because organisations like DFID, which is Department for International Development in the UK, or DFAT, the Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, have on occasion funded interventions working with faith communities in Papua New Guinea or in Uganda or in Rwanda, lots of different settings. And those interventions have been evaluated. And there's a lot to learn from them. There's actually some fantastic resources recently from the Congo for working with Christian and Muslim communities. They are valuable, but it's important, I think, to think, well, how do we translate that knowledge to a high-income setting like Australia, where the context is so different? And often this work works very broadly with communities rather than specifically resources for leaders, which is what our intervention was trying to do. And the other thing we've learned from prevention-focused responses that have been evaluated, and there's two in particular actually from Victoria, and here I really want to sing out to Scott Holmes from the Anglican community in Victoria, who's led a lot of this work going back some time, is that there is definitely challenges in prevention for interfaith approaches, because different faith traditions are starting, they're not all starting on the same page with thinking about gender, relationships between men and women and how they might be related to violence. So people can be sort of talking past each other rather than being on the same page. And also there is a desire to kind of keep your dirty laundry internal you don't want to sort of necessarily share things that are difficult from your faith community with someone from another faith community. So there are real challenges there. I think where there's opportunities from an interfaith approach is around positions and public statements about the importance of addressing violence against women, that the church or that faith leaders across all denominations and faith backgrounds are taking a lead in this. But doing the really hard work of thinking about attitudes and behaviours around gender is difficult in that context. So that's what we do know from the international evidence. What we don't know much about is the non-Abrahamic faith communities. And even within Christianity, there's very little literature about Orthodox and Restorationist communities. So that's an important gap, and a really important gap for Australia, where the two most quickly growing faith traditions in Australia. So there's, as I think someone mentioned, about a very large Muslim community in Australia. That's hugely important, but obviously within the Abrahamic triad. But the two most quickly growing faith traditions at least in Victoria, and I think in Australia, is the Hindu and Sikh traditions. And so being able to engage with communities outside the Abrahamic traditions is really important. There's also major knowledge gaps in how to support religious men who use violence to change their behaviour. And so it's very interesting to hear about the work that Carol mentioned with Matt Bolton, and I do know a little bit about his work, but there's very few examples of that. And behaviour change programming with men is difficult. The evidence is really patchy about what best works. And what we don't know really anything about is how to support men who believe their behaviour is justified by God. You know, it's very, so being in a secular men's behaviour change program is of little value in that circumstance, because that's not who they're answering to. And so I think this is something where men of religion, men of faith, really need to support the wider family violence sector about how to do this better, because we don't do it well. Also gaps in knowledge about other forms of violence that might not be intimate partners, so sexual assault, for example, very limited evidence about how to build capacity, and lack of tools for measuring change over time. But I won't talk so much about that, because I just want to say that what we did, drawing on all of that evidence, was to come up with a short list of principles for organisations doing this kind of work to think about and to draw on when developing your programs. And this might be a useful resource to all of you. The first one is that safety has to come first. So, and this is something where an interfaith approach would be fantastic, to make a public commitment to prioritise women and children's safety, because sometimes different faith leaders or traditions have prioritised the preservation of marriage or the reputation of the community or a whole range of other things, rather than the lives and the safety of women and children who might be experiencing violence. And or men, we do know that there are men who experience family violence, absolutely, and I don't want to neglect that, but the majority of people who experience domestic violence are women and children. The second thing is to strengthen those relationships between secular organisations and faith leaders. And so it was great hearing people talk about, in the examples just before, about ways of doing that, having, whether it's regular meetings, maybe once a quarter or a couple of times a year, just to build the relationship and trust, having referral pathways, the numbers that you can ring, and also making sure faith leaders have current information about new services and interventions in their area. And interventions that also try to build, when you're doing work to build capacity around prevention, that gender equality type focused work, you have to also focus on response, because as soon as you start talking about prevention of violence, people disclose that they've had this experience themselves. And so the faith leaders need to be equipped to be able to respond to that at the time, and what not to do. So there are some things that we know really don't work very well, and there's often, that can be a real tension with the ways that faith leaders often minister to their communities. So, for example, couples counselling. When there's already violence in a relationship, we don't recommend couples counselling at all, because it's often a time when the more powerful party in a couple will manipulate that situation to their own ends, and it can really put usually the woman at risk. So it's more, rather than that kind of direct involvement, it's more journeying with the victim of violence through all the things that they'll need to deal with, whether that's counselling services, the police, the courts, their children's welfare, being by their side. And as Deacon Oliver said, women ring their faith leaders because they want them by their side, but it's not necessarily to do the counselling themselves. Praying, pastoral care, absolutely Material assistance, absolutely, and then referral to people who have real expertise in the domestic violence space. I'm a big believer in any training that you might be doing to try and build capacity of faith leaders or faith communities, that it should be done as a partnership between people of faith and experts in domestic violence, because it'll have much more credibility with faith communities and faith leaders. And also, I am constantly learning from the faith communities that I work with, things that I couldn't possibly, I was brought up in a very devout Catholic household. I have no clue about the Anglican Church, So, and you think that they're all Christian, there must be something where it's similar. It's not at all the case. I'm learning all the time. And so co-delivering things together, knowing kind of the entry points. People of faith have much more expertise in how to gently, a bit like Deacon Oliver said, sometimes you need to introduce things in very firm language where there's sort of no nuance to say, look, safety first, but there might be other things where it's more important to be a bit more nuanced so you don't hit resistance straight away, to be able to bring about change. The fourth principle is really that knowing about that central role of gender inequality, and that is a big part of the early work that we do with faith leaders. And that also means that supporting people from those faith traditions to prepare for and be able to respond to backlash or resistance that might occur. Thinking about intersectionality, which is just a very academic way of acknowledging that we're all different and that people who have come from a migrant and refugee background will have a different experience than people who were born in Australia, that people with disability or living in regional and rural Australia will have different experiences. And here, this also is about Australian-born and trained faith leaders getting skilled in how they communicate and engage with their congregations from a range of communities, but also many traditions bring faith leaders to Australia on religious workers visas. How do we make sure they understand about Australian law and expectations around violence? Delivery mechanisms, I won't go into too much, but thinking about the challenges of interfaith approaches, the importance of face-to-face and conversational kind of approaches. Online training works for facts, but it doesn't work so well for engaging people in the kind of really grappling with the difficult situations that faith leaders face. And then these final two principles is about engaging the senior leadership early, particularly in faith traditions that are quite hierarchical, and strengthening the evidence base. All of the work that you do, trying to document it and make sure that it gets out in the public domain so that we can all learn from it over time. Say that our partner Multicultural Centre for Women's Health host all of the resources that were developed through our project on their website, and there's these three which are longer documents, and then there's a short tip sheet as well, and people are please welcome to go and download theirs.